He is right there? Okay, yeah. Just flag me down there. Everybody else. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to those of us joining, whether here in Griswold or via the live stream. Today, Northwood is hosting the second annual Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Activities Symposium. Undergraduate students engage in many thoughtful and creative research projects during their time here at Northwood. Common forms of research and scholarly activity we often see include community projects, capstone projects, and research papers. This symposium provides an opportunity for students to share their research outside of the classroom. Additionally, it allows the Northwood community to celebrate scholarly contributions. Not only do we have an exciting student lineup for the program, but members of the Student Honors Association will be introducing today's speakers. To introduce the first presenter, please welcome the President of the Student Honors Association, Haley Bates.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Moeller. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter, Jack Anderson. Jack is a sophomore majoring in automotive aftermarket, and today he will be sharing his presentation, Private Property as a Divine Right. His research explores the concept of the divine right to private property, examining its historical, philosophical, and theological foundations. Furthermore, its influence on contemporary discussions about ownership, justice, and individual rights. Please join me in welcoming Jack to the podium.
Good afternoon, guys. Thank you, Ellie. My presentation is on private property as a divine right. My research question is that in what ways does the Bible provide a foundation for today's understanding of property rights? Our first one was found in Deuteronomy 19, verse 14. Do not move your neighbor's boundary stone, aka what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine. Oops, my bad. The second one being Leviticus 25, verse 23. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine and you reside in my land. As foreigners and as strangers, God gave us land and he has expected us to take care of it and nurture it. Thou shalt not steal, Exodus 20, verse 15, is referring back to Deuteronomy 19, verse 14, what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine. Our theological foundations, humans are created in the image of God, divine expectation of stewardship over resources, ownership as a moral responsibility before God, also referring back to Exodus 20, verse 15. God has given us land, and he has expected us to take care of it and nurture it. Our philosophical developments. John Locke, in his second treatise of government, explained how individuals come to own private property through labor. Locke emphasizes that while God gave ownership and humanity in common, individual order transforms common resources into private property. Similarly, Ludwig von Mises, in Liberty and Property, warned us that abolishing private property removes consumer autonomy and subjects people to the arbitrary control and centralized power. Both thinkers reflect an aborted tradition that sees private property not just as economic convenience, but as essential to human dignity and freedom. Our political implications. To protect from unjust government interference, the government cannot take what is rightfully yours at an unjust time. Basis for free and just society and essential for economic and moral order. These ideas have a clear political implication if property rights have divinely rooted and are philosophically justified, then political systems must protect these rights. Societies that respect private property tend to promote individual freedom, economic prosperity, and moral responsibility, while societies that violate private property rights risk oppression and stagnation. To wrap it all up, in conclusion, property rights have a deep roots in biblical teachings, theological reflections, and philosophical thought. Recognizing private property as a divine right reinforces its implication and its importance to personal freedom and social order. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Jack, for that. Good afternoon. I'm Nathan McGuire, and I have the pleasure of introducing a talented team of students from Dr. Kevin McCormick's Introduction to Data Science class. Team members include Reagan Coffey, Corbin Landry, John Walter, and Maximilian Max Wild. Reagan is a second-year student majoring in finance and is unable to attend this afternoon, unfortunately. Corbin is a first-year student studying accounting. John is also in his second year and is majoring in cybersecurity management. And Max is a fourth-year student majoring in international business. Today, they'll be presenting their project titled Hope as a Predictor of Academic Success for College Students. It's a fascinating exploration of how psychological factors like hope can influence student outcomes. Definitely a topic worth our attention. Let's give a warm welcome to Corbin, John, and Max.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our presentation about hope as a predictor of academic success for college students. First of all, the business understanding. Previous studies have shown hope as a predictor of academic success for all college athletes. Also, previous research by Northwood students showed pursuing goals and viewing oneself as successful were the strongest predictors. Our group had three main goals. The first one is test if hope can predict academic success for both athletes and non-athletes. Secondly, to test if hope can predict academic success for students across universities. And lastly, determine if a significant difference in hope factors exists between Northwood students and students from other universities. So what did we do? We made a survey and sent it out to college students, and we got over 110 students across 25 different colleges. We collected basic demographic information, major, gender, and participation in a collegiate sport. So if you're an athlete or if you're non-athlete, GPA. And we had administered a partial adult hope test consisting of 8 questions, scoring participants on a 40-point scale. The most attributes had an acceptable distribution, allowing us to perform our analysis. We cleaned the data in Excel, and then we used 2 programs, Jump and Minitab, to analyze them. So we did not split the data set because it was a very small data set. We only had 110 answers. We also created a scatter plot correlating participants' hope scores with their reported GPAs. We also made a linear regression analysis of participants' responses to each question on the adult hope test. After this, we conducted an ANOVA test to determine if there are any significant differences in hope scores across the university sampled. And lastly, we conducted 2 population t-tests to compare Northwood students and students of other universities by hope scores and responses to the adult hope test questions.
So after we conducted our survey and cleaned our data, we first created a scatter plot of the responses, comparing the cumulative GPA with the hope score that was calculated on a 40-point scale. As you can see, there was a low correlation with an R value of 0.120, which shows that it's not highly correlated. It's not necessarily the greatest predictor, but as we'll see later, it depends on the specific person and each individual and their circumstances. So for a regression analysis, we conducted a regression analysis comparing the hope score, the cumulative GPA with each of the different questions we asked for the hope test. 2 questions were relatively significant, with one having a p-value of 0.0251 and one having a p-value of 0.0675. which are within a somewhat of an acceptable range. One being I can think of many ways to get out of a jam, and the other one being I meet the goals that I set for myself, which also these have a R-squared adjusted value of 0.085, which shows it explains about 85% of the variation in GPA. So in other words, it explains part of the variation, but not all of it. So this is just part of this is just one piece in in explaining the difference in GPA across the students we sampled. But whenever we split it into athletes versus non-athletes, for non-athletes, we got relatively the same model, showing they have a higher hope score, they typically had a higher GPA. This one had a R-squared value of about 10%, but when we looked at with athletes, we got completely different results. Firstly, we got it instead of having two questions that were significant. When we had one, which was even when others will get discouraged, I know I can find ways to solve the problem. And also we had an R-squared value of 0.573. So it shows that it explains about 57.4% of the variation in GPA. So in other words, this is what we found is that depending on if you're an athlete or non-athlete, there's different factors of hope that more or less predict the respondents' GPA some more than others. But I will stress that we only had 23 respondents who were athletes, so our analysis isn't completely sound. But it does show that there is likely hope does depend on the predictive power of hope depends on each individual person and their circumstances. And then for an overtest that we conducted to compare the hope scores across all of the universities we sampled, the test showed that there was no significant difference across the universities, but then again, some of the universities we only had one respondent from, so this wasn't entirely conclusive, but for what we can tell, it doesn't seem to be much of a difference, with all of them being usually between 35 or 25. So there's not a significant difference for GPA. A few universities had some significant differences from the others, but then again, some of the universities we only had one respondent from. So again, we can't really draw many conclusions from this test. However, comparing GPA to the other universities just in general, so the average university, the average non-Northwood student that we sampled versus Northwood students we sampled, we did see that there was a slightly higher cumulative GPA, with there being a p-value of 0.0757, so almost at the 95% confidence level, we could conclude that from the students that we sampled, Northwood students have a slightly higher GPA than other students. But then again, this is the distribution of GPA scores were, for the most part, between 3.0 and 4.0, so we didn't have a nice distribution of GPAs across the full spectrum. And then comparing for versatility, one of the attributes that showed the high predictive power of GPA across between the average university and Northwood University, we didn't find a significant difference. And the same goes for goal setting, the other attribute that we measured. There was no significant difference between the universities.
Okay, so for the model evaluation, goal setting and versatility are the hope-related attributes that significantly predicted academic success. However, with the low R-squared value, it indicates that this only explains 8.5% of the variation in GPA. There's little, if any, variation in GPA or hope scores between the colleges and universities captured in this survey. Beyond the higher cumulative GPAs, there is no significant difference in attributes sampled between Northwood and non-Northwood students. Convenient sample and narrow distribution of GPAs and hope scores may have biased our models. For model deployment, once again, the results indicate that hope, specifically goal setting and versatility, are predictors of academic success. Using this knowledge, it can be incorporated into strategic planning to build a campus culture that sets students up for success. With it only explaining 8.5% of the variance in GPAs, further research is needed to explain the other 91.5%. Inadequate distribution of GPAs and hope scores requires better sampling methods in future research. We suggest sampling high school students.
Thank you, Corbin, John, and Max. Hello, my name is Alex Pizarros, and I am honored to introduce our next presenter, Carney Sala. Carney is a second-year student in Northwood University's accelerated BBA-MBA track. By the time she finishes her MBA, she'll have earned both a bachelor's and master's degree in just 4 years. Carney will be sharing a project she completed in Dr. Nicholas Williams' sports analytics class. Her work focuses on the Northwood softball team's offensive performance over the past 4 seasons, analyzing which offensive metrics have the greatest impacts on wins. Please join me in welcoming Carney.
Hi, I'm just gonna jump right into it. Thank you, Alex. The reason I decided to choose this study was because I'm actually on the Northwood softball team, and I have been for 2 years now. In our sports analytics class, we got to explore something we wanted to look at. Therefore, I looked at the Northwood softball team as it is an important part of my life and could potentially make an impact on the team. I specifically decided to look at the offensive variables, and I compiled 4 years of offensive data from the Northwood softball team and inputted it into SPSS to conduct my study. So the purpose of my study was to analyze the offensive performance metrics of the Northwood softball team over the past 4 seasons. The seasons I decided to look at were the 2021-2022 season to this season now, the 2024-2025 season, and I stopped collecting data about 3 weeks ago. I wanted to look for relationships between various factors and their influence on the outcome of a Northwood softball game. I aim to provide a data-driven perspective, success factors that contribute to the game outcomes. To perform this study, the question it was shaped around was, how does the team's performance in batting determine game outcomes? The significance of this study was to identify key offensive factors that contribute to the softball team's success and overall performance. I did this by identifying statistical patterns and key performance indicators that impact the offensive performance in a softball game. These are just a couple of the previous studies that I decided to look at. A study conducted by Athanasakis in 2021 discussed how loading the bases was the most successful in scoring runs, and also having runners on both third and second base were also very successful. Another study performed by Albert J. found that further research that focuses solely on summary statistics of batting performance may be more insightful to examine. That means that he looked at statistics like strikeouts, walks, and even home runs. My research design was a non-experimental explanatory research. I analyzed each independent variable against the dependent variable using SPSS. Again, I compiled this data from 4 years of Northwood softball, and I conducted descriptive statistics. I tested for outliers, which removed 5 outliers. I ran a factor analysis, and lastly, a multiple linear regression was also performed. The population of this study was 125 softball players from the last 4 seasons, and then also the sample was a non-random sample of 182 games over the past 4 seasons. The limitations of the study were that it did only apply to Northwood softball, and it only applied to the last 4 seasons of Northwood softball. This study is also limited to, it does not include other softball programs, NCAA divisions, and like I said, previous seasons. So the variables that I decided to include were hits, batting average, and runs. These were the variables that were most significant in my study. Some of the variables that I had to remove were walks, hit by pitch, strikeouts, and runners left on base. Our coaches emphasize leaving runners on base, so I definitely wanted to look at that. I even tried to combine walks and being hit by pitch as those both result in getting first base, but both of them combined were not significant enough for this study. For the descriptive statistics that were conducted, I conducted this to assess the mean, standard deviation, and variance of the significant variables. Of the sample size of 182, the mean for hits was 7.29, runs was 4.38, and batting average was 0.264 per game. This means that if Northwood softball in the last 4 seasons was able to reach these goals, that they would most likely win that game. For the factor analysis, I conducted a factor analysis on runs, hits, and batting average to assess the variance. At this time, I did remove walks and hit by pitch, runners left on base, and strikeouts as they had really low factor loadings. For my regression results, I performed a multiple linear regression on hits, runs, batting average, and wins and losses. This revealed that each variable had a positive, significant correlation between wins and losses, and the overall model actually found that these 3 variables that I looked at predicted 40% of the outcome of a Northwood softball game in the last 4 seasons, with a p-value being less than 0.001. These 2 tables here are the results from the regression and the correlation table. In the top table, you can see that the runs have a significant value of less than 0.001 with a positive correlation of 0.623 to wins. Hits also have a positive correlation of 0.46 at a significance value of less than 0.001, and batting average also had a positive correlation of 0.524 at a significance value of less than 0.001. Something else I want to talk about is the correlation between runs and hits, as it had a positive correlation of 0.771, and also runs and batting average with a positive correlation of 0.8. Hits and batting average also had the strongest positive correlation of 0.936, as they both relate to each other. So with my findings, the regression analysis did indicate that 3 offensive factors of hits, runs, and batting average accounted for 40% of the team's wins in the past 4 seasons. 40% is pretty close to half, so I would consider that the data highlights one of the most important factors in focusing on offensive strategies to enhance a team's performance. According to the finding of Athanasaki's, it indicated that hitting the ball, especially with runners in scoring positions, was most significantly related to wins, which is what my study essentially found. Batting average had a high positive correlation with wins. Having a better batting average per game for Northwood made it more likely for a Northwood softball team to score runs, which ultimately leads to hitting. But Albert J. found that it was more beneficial to study aspects of hittings like strikeouts, walks, and home runs. But my study was a little bit different, as I did look at those variables and they were not significant in my study. The total number of runs scored had the strongest positive correlation with wins. Scoring is obviously directly related to winning, but scoring depends on batting average, and then batting average is a direct result of hits. So each variable comes back to hitting, therefore you must hit effectively to win. Some of my implications for Northwood is that for Northwood softball, you could use this data to focus on certain offensive strategies The team can focus on improving hitting, which would improve batting average, which leads to runs, which leads to wins. You need runners on base to score. So Northwood softball must focus on hits and hitting effectively to have runners on base. They could focus on different hitting scenarios, which could include runners on first and second, runners on second and third, hitting with loaded bases, hitting with certain counts, and even hitting with 2 outs. It would be beneficial for Northwood to see how their players perform in these certain situations, so it can provide a deeper level of intel into their offensive capabilities. Northwood could also then focus on certain type of hits. You have ground balls, fly outs, line drives, home runs. As these certain situations are coming up, what type of hit is more beneficial for the team? For an example, with the runner on third, are you going to want to hit the ball, ground ball to the second baseman, or are you going to want to fly out to center field? Examining these things could show Northwood which results are more beneficial and have a better outcome more of the time. Lastly, since I've stated multiple times that this study accounts for 40% of the team's wins, the next study could include focusing on defensive strategies and pitching. By expanding the study to include those parameters of defensive metrics, pitching performance, and other situational variables, it could provide a more comprehensive understanding of the factors that lead to team success. In softball and in baseball, hitting is something everyone must do with the exception of pitchers. I know our pitchers on the Northwood softball team, a couple of them do like to hit and they swing the bat pretty well. But if the pitchers are having a really good day on the mound and you're at a certain position, you may not get the ball hit to you all day, but you will most certainly have 3 at-bats. Hitting is something that every player can control and has to do during the game. As hitting accounted for predicting 40% of Northwood softball wins, 60% is somewhere else. But with that being said, the other 60% is distributed between defensive metrics, pitching, and other situational or cultural variables. This means that pitching could be 20, defense could be 20, and culture of the team could also be 20%, making offense the most important variable. As I personally aspire to work in intercollegiate athletics, using data like this can help coaches and administrators make informed, data-driven decisions. Overall, this data can help Northwood softball make certain decisions, as hitting is a very significant part of winning. This can help the coaches make effective lineups, practice what we need to practice in practice, and what to look for even when recruiting. Thank you.
Thank you, Carney. Our next presenter is Blake Beechnow, a senior majoring in operations and supply chain management. Blake's presentation, Blood and Brotherhood, was submitted in his American Civil War and Reconstruction class taught by Dr. Dale Muller. His research focuses on the battle experiences of Union and Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. Despite their differences, all soldiers shared identical struggles. To share more about this topic, please welcome Blake.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. My presentation, Blood and Brotherhood, covers the Battle of Stones River specifically, and one Union and one Confederate soldier and the similarities in their experiences during this battle. But before I get into their stories, I'd like to share the assignment criteria that got me here today for this presentation. So during my Civil War class, during the first half of the spring semester, we were tasked with a research paper about a battle during the Civil War. It couldn't just be any battle. We had to avoid the major ones like Gettysburg and Bull Run, and we had to focus on ones that don't get covered as often in history classes. So I chose Stones River. And for this, I had to find 2 primary sources, include a scholarly source, and build a conclusion from my research. So as any college student does, they go into ChatGPT and they say, find me primary resources for a Civil War battle. And so I began reading through ChatGPT and the different sources that it provided me. And I stumbled across this one for Stones River, which is Captain Henry Richards of the 93rd Ohio Infantry. He was on the front lines at Stones River, and he's writing this letter to his father a few days after the battle is concluded. Some key points in his letter are battle details. He talks a lot about what the Union Army was doing during this battle, what his key responsibilities were doing, people he might have worked alongside of, and he put an emphasis on people he knew who had died. This is a long quote to read, but it summarizes who he is as a person and as a soldier and how in-depth he went on details of the battle. He liked to describe a lot of what was going on and what his responsibilities were, but he also ended this quote off with saying, "At night, we had resisted every attempt for them to drive us back, and the position of affairs was rather in our favor, but the slaughter was terrible," emphasizing the strong Union advance was victorious, but the death around him of his friends and comrades was just as good. Which leads me to my second source, which is Private Andrew Walker of the Confederacy. He's from the 12th Battalion, Tennessee. He was also at the front lines of Stones River, and he's writing this to his uncle 5 days after the battle concluded. In similar fashion, he is focusing on his responsibilities during the battle, what the Confederates' plans were, and also people he knew who had died. But the tone of his letter is very different. He emphasizes how strong the Confederate Army was and how weak the Union Army was. He says here, "The way the Southern fight is like wild cats," and that's the tone of his whole article, is just how strong the Confederate Army is. And finally, my scholarly source was a book we've been reading throughout this semester, which is This Republic of Suffering by Drew Faust. This book focuses on the dark side of the Civil War that doesn't get talked about enough, especially in our high school classes, which is the death, burial, mourning, and the toll that death takes on America during the Civil War. This book provides many primary sources from many different battles, soldiers on the front line, civilians that were near the battles, as well as some newspaper articles and pictures of people who were directly impacted by the death during the Civil War. And the overall message of this book is that every soldier has the same struggles, and that is death, and they're all dealing with it in their own different ways, and they all have to deal with it. So now I have all these sources, and I need to put them together into a research paper. I need to make them feel the same, sound the same, find some similarities, find how they're different, and connect two soldiers that are shooting at each other and make it into a good sounding essay. And so first I look at some comparisons. And like I mentioned before, they both describe details of the battle and the loss of life of soldiers that were around them. But the biggest comparison I noticed was the tone and the emotion of the message and their complaints of the living conditions, how tired and defeated they were and ready to return home. Walker mentions in his letter that he has to stop writing because it's nighttime and there's no light, while Richards mentions that there's no fires allowed, he has no blankets, and he's out of paper. And at first I read these and they were at the end of their letter and I didn't think too much about it, but the more I dove into it, the more I realized that these are very, very similar. Walker saying he has no light, meaning he has no fire, as well as Richards has no fire. So these soldiers they're cold, they're sick, they're hungry, they're likely sleeping in the dirt, in the wet. And Faust mentions in her book as well that during some of the battles, soldiers would take some of the deceased bodies and cover themselves up with it for warmth. So these horrid conditions are on both sides of the battlefield, and troops are dealing with it. And now for kind of differences, I'll get here in a second. Walker, the Confederate soldier, writes about how strong the Confederate Army was and how weakened the Union Army was, like I mentioned, while Richards mostly emphasizes the strong Union advancements, which ultimately led the Union to victory in the battle. I saw this as a big difference at first until I analyzed it some more, and I was wondering why Walker didn't include how they lost the battle and they were retreating, and why Richards didn't include how strong the Confederate forces were when they got there. And then I realized who the audience was. Richards is writing to his father and Walker to his uncle. And so I put myself in their shoes. And if I was on the front lines of this battlefield writing back to my family, what would I want to say? And I would say exactly what they did. I would avoid anything that made my army or me seem weak. And I would want it to seem like we're doing great and we're strong. And so it wouldn't cause for any fear or worry back home. Now for my scholarly source tying this in. Once I've evaluated these two sources and found that they're very similar, and I'm going to structure my essay around these similarities, the Faust book tied in perfectly because all it's about is shared experiences, especially around the topic of death. Death is something that soldiers cannot overcome. Faust talks a lot about the work of death, which is the duties of these soldiers they have when they go to the front lines to fight, kill, and especially the duty to die for their country. But these come with consequences such as slaughter, suffering, and devastation. She talks about things we know today as PTSD for these soldiers during the war and after the war, and then the devastation they see on the battlefield. And here's the structure and conclusion to my research essay. You have two soldiers, one from the north, one from the south, and at one point in time, who knows, they might have been pointing a gun at each other, firing at each other, and now they're lying asleep in the trenches of Stones River, cold and hungry. And you can, if you erase their names from these letters and you completely get rid of their affiliation to the Union or the Confederacy, these could very well be brothers. It could be the same person writing these letters. Their tone, battle descriptions, and emotion show that this is one and the same person writing from just a separate side, and they've been put to war against each other. And whether they believe or not in what they're fighting for, once they get to the front lines, it's a whole different story. And so what I gained from this research study was deep dives into short sources. Many of these letters were 1 to 3 paragraphs long, and I had to write a 4-page essay on it. So it took a lot of unpacking of information that's not written there. I had to put myself in their shoes and see it from a personal perspective, how I would feel if I was there, what I could imagine they're going through. Writing it just off what they say doesn't always paint the full picture. And so using these resources, I was able to connect 2 people trying to kill each other to ended up being what could have been brothers as their shared experiences. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Blake. Our final presenter today is Anthony Storr. Anthony is in his second year at Northwood and is majoring in both finance and economics. Earlier this year, Anthony and his teammates Barrett Teft and Noel Tokarev competed in the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics League competition in Ottawa, Kansas, where they debated immigration policy from various world perspectives. In preparation for this competition, Anthony conducted in-depth research in both conservative and libertarian schools of thought. His presentation today explores the interdisciplinary tensions between these two outlooks, clarifying the philosophical, political, and economic contrasts that shape their divergent world views on immigration. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anthony.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Tokarev for his guidance on this project and his continued support of me in my academic journey. I'm also grateful for the professors and faculty at Northwood University, particularly Dr. Nash and Professor Zienert. Your mentorship has been instrumental, not only in shaping this presentation, but in my broader intellectual journey and future aspirations. My project today emerged from my engagement with the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics League competition in Ottawa, Kansas, where my team and I explored the fundamental differences between various worldviews on immigration. We analyzed these differing worldviews from the interdisciplinary lenses of politics, philosophy, and economics, the union of which create a compelling argument for each perspective. My research focus was directed toward comparing the conservative view with the libertarian view from these 3 interdisciplinary bases. Beginning with the politics of the conservative view on immigration, immigration policy expresses a nation's sovereignty and the limits of governmental authority. Conservative perspectives typically prioritize stringent border control as essential to preserving national sovereignty. The Trump administration's Securing Our Borders initiative, which enacted 10 executive orders designed to clarify state and federal roles in immigration enforcement, reflects the conservative viewpoint. Such measures reinforce the belief that clearly delineated and enforceable immigration laws maintain social order and uphold political integrity. Furthermore, conservatives posit that the basis for immigration should be rooted in the capacity of an immigrant to consent to the American idea. As a basis for this, conservatives often cite the 14th Amendment, which states that immigrants must pledge their fealty and allegiance to be, quote, under the jurisdiction thereof, end quote. In contrast, libertarians often argue that state authority should not unduly infringe upon individual freedom and autonomy, including freedom of movement. Scholars contend that stringent border policies unjustly limit individuals' freedom and property rights. They assert that immigration restrictions should be minimized unless directly necessary for safeguarding individual rights. In doing so, libertarians emphasize limiting state intervention, asserting that open borders align with personal autonomy and economic liberty. Philosophically, the divergence of these perspectives intensifies. Conservatives ground their immigration stance within the framework of the social contract and mutual obligation. Drawing from John Locke, they underscore the notion that robust, enforceable laws are essential for preserving freedom within a society. Locke's principle, where there is no law, there is no freedom, encapsulates the conservative ethos. Borders represent not just geographical limits, but moral and political boundaries, critical for sustaining mutual obligations and societal cohesion. This conservative emphasis is further elucidated by the principle of Ordo Amoris, or the order of love, drawn from Augustine and Aquinas. Ordo Amoris asserts a natural moral order wherein individuals and states have stronger duties towards those closest to them by proximity or circumstance. Augustine of Hippo articulated that while universal benevolence is commendable, moral responsibility, first and foremost, extends to one's immediate community. Consequently, conservatives such as J.D. Vance apply Ordo Amoris to argue for prioritizing the welfare of existing citizens and communities. Immigration policy from this viewpoint must first and foremost secure the well-being and stability of current citizens before admitting outsiders whose integration and contributions remain uncertain. Libertarians challenge this philosophical stance, arguing that the state must maintain value neutrality. They postulate that the system must have universal moral equality, contending birthplace and national boundaries are morally arbitrary. From this perspective, limiting immigration based on national allegiance contradicts fundamental liberal principles of equal human dignity and natural rights. Philosophers like Joseph Cairns highlight the moral arbitrariness of birthplace, advocating for policies grounded in global justice rather than national preference. They further emphasize that exclusionary immigration policies often result in unjust coercion, restricting migrants' freedom and autonomy without moral justification. Lastly, conservatives and libertarians also diverge significantly in an economical stance. Conservatives highlight the fiscal pressures and labor market disruptions caused by lax immigration policies. They often point to increased welfare expenditures, depressed wages for low-skilled native workers, and the strain on public resources. The Congressional Budget Office, for instance, reported considerable Medicaid expenditures associated with undocumented immigrants under open border policies, underscoring conservative concerns about the unsustainable financial burdens imposed by unchecked immigration. Libertarians, on the other hand, counter these economic arguments by emphasizing immigration's net economic benefits, such as increasing labor supply, consumer market expansion, and enhanced global economic efficiency. In support of this view, economist Michael Clemens argues persuasively that liberalizing labor mobility could increase global GDP substantially, more than removing barriers to trade or capital flows. Libertarians maintain that restrictions on immigration represent economically suboptimal arrangements, unjustifiable given potential global welfare gains. Yet conservatives' concerns regarding economic inequality and redistribution persist. Economist George Boris highlights that while immigration may boost total economic output, it also redistributes wealth within receiving countries, creating winners and losers. Conservatives argue that the native working class disproportionately suffers wage declines, while benefits primarily accrue to employers and capital owners. Hence, conservative immigration policy preferences often favor skilled immigrants over unrestricted entry to protect domestic labor markets and minimize fiscal pressures. Moreover, conservatives frequently invoke concerns about societal cohesion and cultural integration. Robert Putnam's research indicates that high ethnic diversity can diminish social trust and civic participation. This underscores the conservative apprehension. Conservatives perceive cultural cohesion as integral to political stability, maintaining that immigration policies must carefully manage cultural integration to preserve societal trust and cooperation. Libertarians, however, respond by stressing the adaptability of societies and the intrinsic value of cultural pluralism. They assert that initial challenges to societal cohesion diminish over time. giving way to enhanced innovation and vibrancy from diverse cultural inputs. They also highlight the ethical dimensions of inclusivity and argue the long-term integration efforts, rather than restrictive policies, best serve both immigrant populations and receiving societies. Ultimately, understanding the debate between conservative and libertarian immigration policies requires recognizing the distinct philosophical foundations underpinning each. Conservatives adhere to subjectively higher moral codes and the concept of bounded social contracts that emphasize the preservation of national community and societal cohesion. In the universal utilitarian comprehension, libertarians prioritize universal human dignity, personal autonomy, and global economic efficiency, which leads them to advocate for more open immigration policies. Navigating these differing viewpoints necessitates an interdisciplinary approach encompassing politics, philosophy, and economics. It is not merely a policy choice, but a reflection of deeper moral and ideological commitments that shape national identity, control the cultural impetus, and economic trajectory. In addressing immigration policy, it is important to consider the implications with intellectual humility. We must ultimately weigh immediate economic and cultural impacts against broader ideals of liberty, justice, and human flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to all of our student presenters. That was great. Also want to extend a thank you to our audience members, both in the room and on the live stream. We appreciate your time and your attention this evening. Again, this is our second annual Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Activities Symposium. We're working on building up some good momentum, so we appreciate all the support. A couple other thank yous. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to the staff who helped put this together, especially Carrie Taylor. She definitely deserves a round of applause. And finally, last but certainly not least, a huge thank you to our faculty members who helped nominate and support our students through this process. It's a lot of work to get one of these presentations ready to go. So the faculty members who poured their time and energy into this, we appreciate that a lot. In order to celebrate the hard work of our undergrads, there's a reception in the lobby afterwards. We invite you to come celebrate with us. Thank you again for coming by this evening. Have an excellent night.